In this section, you're going to learn how to write queries that summarize data. For example, you will learn how to write queries that report sales by clients or state, so we can see how much we have sold in each different state. These are the answers to some common questions that businesses ask. So the stuff that I'm going to show you in this section are extremely useful, especially if you work in a large organization with lots of data. Every single day, you'll have to write queries to summarize data. So let's get started. The first thing you need to understand is how to use aggregate functions in SQL. So a function, as I told you before, is a piece of code that we can reuse. MySQL comes with a bunch of built-in functions. Some of these functions are called aggregate functions because they take a series of values and aggregate them to produce a single value. For example, we have the max function for calculating the maximum in a series of values. We also have min, average, sum for calculating the total, as well as count. Now, with all these functions, as you can see, we'll have to use parentheses to call or execute them. Now, let me show you a few examples of these functions. So, in this demo, I'm going to use our SQL invoicing database. Let's select the maximum of invoice total column from the invoices table. There you go. So our highest invoice total is $189. Now look at the name of this column. It's set to the same expression we used here. So let's rename it to something more meaningful like highest. Now in the same query, we can also calculate the minimum. So min of invoice total as lowest. We can also add the average of invoice total as average. Let's execute the query. So here's our lowest invoice total, and the average of all our invoices is about $150. Now in this example, I'm applying these functions on a column that has numeric values, but you can also apply them on dates and strings. For example, we can change invoice total to payment date. Now, the value that we have here is the latest date when we received a payment. Okay, so let me revert this back to invoice total. We can also calculate the total of values in this column using the sum function. So sum of invoice total as total. And finally count to count the records. So invoice total one more time as number of invoices. Let's execute the query. So in this table, we have 17 invoices and our total sales is just over $2,500. Now, one thing you need to know about these aggregate functions is that they only operate on non-null values. So if you have a null value in this column, it's not going to be included in these functions. Let me show you where that matters. So as another example, I'm going to calculate the count of payment date. So let's rename it to count of payments. So as you know, this column accepts null values. So when we execute this query, we get 15 because not all of our invoices have been paid. So the count function returns the count of records with non-null payment dates. Okay. Now, if you want to get the total number of records in a table, irrespective of null values, you would have to use count of star. So as total records, let's execute it. There you go. So in this table, we have a total of 17 records. Now let me delete lines 6 and 7. We don't need them anymore. Another thing you need to understand here is that most of the time we use column names here, but we can also write an expression. For example, here we can write an expression like invoice total times 1.1. When MySQL tries to execute this query, first it will get the values in this column. It will multiply each value by 1.1, and then it will apply the sum function on those values. Okay. Also, if you have a filter here, these functions calculate the summary values for records that match your search criteria. For example, let's say where invoice date is greater than 2019, July 1st. So we only want to get the invoices for the second half of the year. Now, when we re-execute this query, we're going to see different values here. Let me show you. So we only have 7 records that match this criteria. And our total is also changed. So here we have the total sales for all the invoices issued in the second half of the year. And here's one last thing you need to know. By default, all these functions take duplicate values. If you want to exclude duplicates, you will have to use the distinct keyword. Let me show you an example. So instead of calculating the total number of records, let's calculate the records that have a client ID. So we get 7, but if you look at the data in this table, you will see that many of these clients are duplicated. Let's have a quick look here. So here's the invoices table. There you go. So we have client 5 duplicated in a few places. Same is true for client 3. So our count function is returning the count of records that have a client ID. It doesn't care if we have duplicates or not. If you want to count only the unique values, you will have to use the distinct keyword. So back to our query. Here in our count function, we use the distinct keyword. And now when we execute this query, instead of 7, we get 3 because we have 3 unique clients that have an invoice after this date. All right, here's a fantastic exercise for you to practice what you have learned so far. Write a query against the invoices table to generate this report. So here we have 4 columns: date range, total sales, total payments, and what we expect, which is the difference between these 2 columns. Now in this table, we have 3 records. First, we see all the amounts for the first half of 2019. Then we see all the amounts for the second half of 2019, followed by the total. So go ahead and spend 2 to 3 minutes on this exercise. When you're done, come back, continue watching. All right, first, let's calculate all the values for the first half of 2019. So we select a string literal or a label, first half of 2019, and we give it an alias as date range. Otherwise, the name of our column is going to be first half of 2019. That's not what we want, right? Next, we calculate the sum of invoice total and rename it to total sales. Then we calculate the total payments. So payment total as total payments. And finally, sum of invoice total minus payment total. And we call this what we expect. We're going to select all these values from the invoices table, where invoice date is between 2019 January 1st and 2019 June the 30th. So I'm going to put this on a new line so you can see clearly. There you go. This is our date range. This is our date range for the first half of the year, right? Let's execute this query. All right, this is what we get. Beautiful. Now we need to calculate the same values for the second half of the year. So to split things up, I'm going to copy this entire query. Then after our select statement, I'm going to write a union and then paste our select statement. Now we change this label to second half of 2019, as well as our search criteria. So we only want to select the invoices where invoice date is between July 1st and December 31st. Let's execute our query one more time. All right, beautiful. Finally, we need to calculate the total for all invoices in 2019. So one more time, we're going to use the union operator and paste our query. Then we're going to change the label to total. And finally, our search criteria is going to be from January 1st to December 21st. Let's execute the query one more time. And here's the end result.